Philosophy has been trying to explain how the mind relates to the world for roughly 400 years. It has produced two broad families of answer, and both have failed in the same way. The rationalist says the mind imposes structure on experience, and what we call the world is experience organized by the categories the mind brings to it. The empiricist says the mind receives sensory inputs and builds its picture of the world from the data those inputs provide. The rationalist cannot explain how the mind's categories make genuine contact with anything beyond themselves. The empiricist cannot explain how bare sensory inputs become the organized, meaningful, object-directed experience we actually have. Both traditions take for granted the very thing that needs explaining. The fact that experience is already of something, already directed at a world, already structured as the appearance of objects with specific characters. They argue about the source of that structure without first asking what it means for experience to have it at all. Phenomenology is the attempt to ask that prior question with the full rigour it deserves. Its founding claim is simple and radical. Before you can explain consciousness, you have to describe it, and the description done carefully reveals structures that every prior theory had missed. Edmund Husserl, working in Germany at the turn of the 20th century, identified those structures under the name of intentionality, and built a method for investigating them that he called phenomenological reduction. Everything that followed, Heidegger's ontology of existence, Sartre's phenomenology of freedom, Merleau-Ponty's account of the lived body, Levinas's ethics of the face, the contemporary debates about naturalization and critical phenomenology, grew from Husserl's initial move, and from the problems it generated. What you are about to hear is not a survey of positions. It is a reconstruction of the reasoning that drove the tradition forward, the problems that each thinker inherited from the one before, and the new problems their solutions created. Each major figure in phenomenology produced their central ideas by pressing on a tension that their predecessor had left unresolved. Heidegger's being in the world is not an alternative to Husserl's intentionality. It is a response to a specific flaw in Husserl's account of what intentionality presupposes. Sartre's consciousness as nothingness is not a correction to Heidegger. It is a response to a specific claim Husserl made about the structure of the ego. Levinas's account of the face is not an independent ethical theory. It is the consequence of following the logic of the phenomenological account of the other, to the point where that account collapses under its own weight. The tradition is unified not by shared conclusions, but by a shared problem that none of its thinkers fully solved. That problem is the relationship between the first-person structure of experience and everything that exceeds it, the world that is more than what appears, the other person who is genuinely other and not a projection, the body that acts before consciousness decides, the time that flows without a further ground, and the history and social structure that shape experience all the way down, not merely at the surface. Every debate in contemporary phenomenology, the debate over naturalization, the critical phenomenological challenge to universalist claims, the contest between transcendental and hermeneutic approaches, turns on some version of this problem. You are not here to learn the history of a tradition. You are here to think a problem that is still alive. Part 1. The problem before the method. Why consciousness resisted. Every prior framework. Consider what happens when a scientist sets out to study consciousness using standard scientific tools. She forms hypotheses, identifies causal mechanisms, and tests claims against controlled observations. Every one of those operations already depends on consciousness working in a specific, reliable way. The object of study is the very capacity performing the study. This is not a practical difficulty that better instruments could resolve. It is structural, and no refinement of scientific method touches it. By the late 19th century, the dominant response to this problem was psychologism. Psychologism holds that the laws of logic and mathematics are laws describing how human minds actually operate. The law of non-contradiction, on this view, becomes a regularity in human cognition rather than a timeless necessity. This position had genuine appeal because it kept logic continuous with natural science and required no mysterious realm of abstract objects. Its defenders were serious philosophers working in the emerging discipline of scientific psychology. The problem is that psychologism fails precisely on its own terms, in a way that is decisive and irreparable. If logical laws are contingent truths about how human minds operate, they could, in principle, have been otherwise. A being with different cognitive architecture might reason under different logical laws. But then the argument you use to defend psychologism carries no greater authority than "this is how we happen to reason." You have invoked logical validity to argue that logical validity is merely contingent psychological regularity. The conclusion cancels the argument that produces it. This is the specific point where psychologism collapses, not empirically, but through internal self-defeat. Husserl pressed this critique in the Prolegomena to the Logical Investigations in 1900. It forced a question that none of the available frameworks could satisfactorily answer. If logical necessity is not psychological regularity, where does it come from, and how do finite minds grasp it? Platonism answers that logical objects exist independently of any mind, accessible through a special cognitive faculty. But this relocates the mystery rather than dissolving it. The question becomes how physical neural processes make contact with non-physical abstract objects at all. Kantian transcendentalism offered a different answer. Necessity derives from the structure of cognition itself. All possible objects must conform to the conditions of possible experience, which is what makes necessary truths available to finite minds. Kantianism, however, generated its own equally serious problem. If the categories of understanding impose form on experience and things in themselves remain inaccessible, then the objective world is a cognitive construction. Necessity is preserved, but any claim to describe mind-independent reality as it actually is becomes unavailable. Kant posits a transcendental ego as the formal unity underlying experience, but offers no account of how that ego could examine its own structure. What was needed was a method for examining the structures of experience exactly as they give themselves, without presupposing any theoretical framework. Introspective psychology could not provide this. It was already embedded in the natural attitude it was supposed to ground. Kantian transcendental analysis could not provide it either, because it approached those structures deductively rather than descriptively. Empiricism started from sensory data and could never recover the necessity that logic requires. Rationalism started from rational structure and could never explain why that structure genuinely contacts anything beyond itself. Both traditions assumed the relation between mind and world was settled, and argued only about which side was primary. Phenomenology was the attempt to examine that relation before either side had been privileged. Its commitment was to the phenomena themselves, as they appear in experience before scientific explanation has redescribed them. But doing this rigorously requires a prior account of how consciousness is directed at things at all. What makes it possible for experience to be of an object rather than merely a state or event? That account was the one thing psychologism got partly right before getting it catastrophically wrong. It came from Brentano, and it contained a flaw severe enough to force Husserl to dismantle and reconstruct the entire framework. Part 2. Intentionality without the psychologist's fallacy, Brentano's wager, and its flaw. The question of what distinguishes mental phenomena from physical ones had been answered many ways. They differ in substance, in Descartes, in their dependency on a nervous system, for the physiologist, in their privacy, for the introspectionist. Brentano's answer, in Psychology, from an empirical standpoint in 1874, was different in kind from all of these. He proposed that every mental phenomenon is essentially characterized by directedness toward an object. When you believe something. When you desire something. When you fear something. No physical phenomenon has this structure. A stone falling is not falling at something in the relevant sense. Brentano called this property intentional inexistence, borrowing language from the medieval scholastics. The term is easily misread and has been systematically misread in analytic philosophy as meaning that the object of thought fails to exist. That is not what Brentano meant. He meant that the object is inexistent in the mental act in the sense of dwelling within it, having a kind of existence inside the act rather than only outside in the world. On this picture, when you think of a tree, the tree as an intentional object inhabits your mental act as a constituent of it. The object is immanent to the act. This immanentism was the wager, and it was both Brentano's strength and his fatal flaw. Its strength, it explained how you can think of non-existent objects, dragons, round squares, the present King of France. The dragon doesn't exist in the world, but something is present as the object of your thought, and that something is immanent to the act itself. No external referent is required for intentionality to operate. Its flaw. If the object of every mental act is immanent to that act, you have effectively sealed consciousness inside itself, and the question of how any mental act reaches genuinely transcendent, mind-independent objects becomes unanswerable. You now have two trees, the real tree outside and the intentional tree inside, and no account of how they connect. Husserl recognized this problem in the logical investigations as requiring a fundamental structural revision. He was not simply adding a corrective, he was replacing the entire architecture. His move was to distinguish three things that Brentano had conflated: the intentional act, the intentional content, and the intentional object. The act is the type of mental event, perceiving, remembering, desiring. The content, which Husserl eventually systematized as the noema, is the meaning through which the object is presented, the object as intended under a specific set of determinations. The object itself is what the act is about, which can remain numerically identical across many different acts and contents. Holding a specific white coffee cup in your hand, you can perceive it, remember it later, imagine it broken, wish you had another one. Each of these is a different act, directed through a different content, but aimed at the same object. The cup is not inside any of these acts. It is their transcendent target, given through content but not reducible to it. This move breaks Brentano's immanentism without sacrificing the insight that intentionality is the mark of the mental. Consciousness can now be genuinely world-directed without having to duplicate the world inside itself. But this structural revision introduced a problem that Brentano's version had avoided. If the object of experience is genuinely transcendent to the act, then the object can fail to exist while the act retains its full intentional structure. Perceptual hallucination and veridical perception share the same phenomenological character from the inside. The act of seeing a pink elephant has the full structure of intentionality, even if there is no pink elephant. This means intentionality cannot be explained by a causal relation between the object and the act, since the relation obtains even when the object is absent. The content, the noema, must be doing the work of directing the act toward its object, independently of whether the object exists. But the noema is a strange entity, not the object itself, not merely a mental state, but something with a kind of ideal identity that multiple acts can share. Here is where Husserl's revision generates a debate that remains unresolved in current literature. Dagfinn Føllesdal read the noema as structurally analogous to a Phrygian sense, an abstract entity that mediates reference, determining an object without being identical to it. On this reading, Husserl is an internalist about intentional content. The object is fixed by what is cognitively accessible to the subject. John Drummond and others argued that the noema is not an intermediary at all, but the object itself as given from a perspective, which is closer to a direct realist reading. The difference is load-bearing. On the Føllesdal reading, Husserl faces the same problems as any internalist theory of content, including the twin earth problem, where two subjects with identical inner states are directed at different objects. On the Drummond reading, that problem does not arise, but the account of intentionality in hallucinatory cases becomes harder to sustain. Brentano's psychologism also did not fully disappear from Husserl's inheritance. Brentano wanted intentionality to found a rigorous descriptive psychology, a science of mental acts catalogued by their type and direction. Husserl kept the descriptive ambition, but insisted that the structures being described are not empirical psychological facts, but essential structures that any possible consciousness must exhibit. This is the difference between psychology as a natural science and phenomenology as an eidetic discipline, one concerned with essences rather than contingent facts. The distinction is crucial, because if phenomenology is just introspective psychology with better vocabulary, it inherits all the problems Husserl diagnosed in psychologism. But if it is genuinely an eidetic science, we need to know how we gain access to essences without simply doing empirical psychology by another name. Part 3. The reduction that cannot quite be performed. Husserl's Epoché and its internal crisis. You wake up in the morning and proceed through the day without pausing to wonder whether the objects around you actually exist. The floor is there. You walk on it. The coffee is there. You drink it. Objects are just present, requiring no theoretical justification, soliciting your engagement and receding as you move on. Husserl called this the natural attitude, and it is not a mistake. It is the operative background assumption within which all ordinary activity and all natural science proceeds. The natural attitude poses a problem for phenomenology. If we want to study how consciousness constitutes its objects, we cannot conduct that study from within the natural attitude, because from within it, objects simply are, and consciousness appears as just one more item in the already constituted world. What is needed is a shift in orientation that makes the constituting activity visible rather than invisible. Husserl's instrument for this is the Epoché, from the Greek skeptical term for suspension of judgment. The Epoché is not a skeptical move, and it is not Cartesian doubt. Descartes' doubt aimed at demolishing the natural attitude to rebuild on secure foundations. The Epoché merely suspends the act of existence positing, leaving the world's appearance entirely intact. The distinction is precise and important. After performing the Epoché, I still have the full experience of the room around me, the desk, the lamp, the window. Nothing is removed from the field of experience. What is suspended is only my implicit commitment to those things existing in the mind-independent sense, the general thesis of the natural attitude. What remains after the suspension is the phenomenon, the desk as appearing, with all its experiential richness intact, available for description as a structure of consciousness rather than as a fact about the physical world. Husserl calls this residuum the field of transcendental consciousness, and it is what phenomenological analysis is supposed to describe. This is where the internal crisis begins. The Epoché is supposed to reveal transcendental subjectivity as the ground of all constitution, the consciousness for which all objects appear as what they are. But consider who is performing the reduction. I am. And I am an embodied human being situated in a social world, with a history, a language, and a set of presuppositions so deep I cannot explicitly enumerate them. When I perform the Epoché, do I bracket all of that? If I do, what is left to perform the bracketing? Husserl's student Eugen Fink pressed this problem directly in his sixth Cartesian meditation, eventually published in 1988, but worked out in dialogue with Husserl in the early 1930s. Fink argued that in order to perform the reduction, I must already have a concept of the world as that which is to be suspended and a concept of the human being as the one doing the suspending. But those concepts are themselves drawn from within the natural attitude. The reduction, therefore, cannot be performed from a standpoint that is entirely outside the natural attitude, because the tools for performing it are themselves inside it. This is not a pedantic difficulty. It means the transcendental standpoint that the reduction was supposed to open up may be permanently contaminated by the worldly standpoint it was supposed to surpass. Husserl's response was to distinguish the empirical ego, the ordinary human self situated in the world, from the transcendental ego, the consciousness that remains as the phenomenological residuum after the reduction. The transcendental ego is not a second self standing behind the empirical one. It is the empirical ego viewed from a different angle, as constituting rather than constituted. The relationship between them is one of abstractive focus rather than ontological duplication. But this creates its own instability. If the transcendental ego and the empirical ego are the same ego viewed differently, then the move to transcendental standpoint is a shift of attitude rather than a move to a different ontological level. And if it is only a shift of attitude, the question of what grounds that attitude reasserts itself. There is also a second internal problem, less frequently emphasized, but arguably more severe. The reduction is supposed to reveal consciousness as the absolute ground of all constitution, with nothing outside it that has not been constituted by it. But the flow of consciousness itself, the temporal stream that runs through all experience, is something consciousness encounters rather than simply enacts. Husserl was aware of this. In the lectures on time consciousness, he acknowledges that the stream of consciousness constitutes itself, that its self-appearance does not require a second act of consciousness to observe it. But self-constituting is not a stable concept. Either the stream is active with respect to itself, which requires distinguishing constituting moments from constituted ones within the same stream, or it is passive, which means something constitutes it from outside. These problems did not paralyze the tradition, they redirected it. Heidegger concluded that the reduction was the wrong instrument, because it still operated within the framework of a subject standing over against a world of objects. Merleau-Ponty concluded that the reduction could never be fully performed, and that this was not a failure but a discovery. Consciousness is not a transparent sphere sealed from the world, but something entangled with it at every level. The unfinished character of the Epoché turned out to be a finding rather than a methodological deficit. But accepting that conclusion required rethinking the temporal structure of consciousness, because that was where the self-sufficiency of the transcendental standpoint first began to crack. This is where the tradition had to go next, and it produced the most technically difficult analysis in all of phenomenology. Part 4. Time Eating Itself. Husserl's Phenomenology of Internal Time Consciousness. You are listening to someone play a melody. Each note has a certain pitch and duration, sounds, and then stops sounding. If experience were strictly punctual, confined to the knife edge of the present moment, each note would appear and vanish in isolation, and what you would hear would be a series of disconnected sounds rather than a melody. The melody requires the just-past notes to be somehow still present as you hear the current one, not as memories you are consciously recalling, but as actively part of the ongoing experience. Something must account for this temporal extension of the experiential present. And whatever that something is, it had better not be memory, because memory represents the past as past, at a distance, whereas the melody is heard as flowing now. Brentano had a solution. He argued that the just-past note is originally associated with the current impression, meaning it is carried alongside the present moment as a kind of prolonged content, represented in the current instant. This preserves temporal continuity without requiring a special new kind of intentional act. Husserl's objection was precise. Original association on Brentano's model means the past note is represented, brought back into the present as a current content. But that makes the past note phenomenologically twice present, once when it originally sounded, and again in its representation now. Representation cannot capture the specific character of the just past, because it converts the past into a species of the present. Retention is not representation. When you hear the current note, the just past note is not presented again as if it were sounding. It is held in a modified, fading form that is explicitly characterized as no longer now. The pastness of the retained content is part of its phenomenological character, not a judgment you add after the fact. Husserl describes this as the comet's tail of the living present, the current moment trailing behind it a structured fringe of just elapsed experience in progressively attenuated form. He names the three structural components: primal impression, retention, and pretension. The primal impression is the narrow now phase of the object. Retention holds the just elapsed phase in its having just been now character. Pretension is the forward-leaning anticipation of the immediately coming phase. These three are not three separate acts occurring simultaneously. They are structurally inseparable moments of a single unified act of temporal awareness, what Husserl calls the living present. You cannot have a primal impression without retention, because without retention you would have no awareness of temporal succession, and the note sounding would be experienced as an isolated event with no past. You cannot have a primal impression without pretension either, because pretension is what generates the experience of surprise. If you are listening to a familiar melody and someone plays the wrong note, you are surprised. That surprise is possible only because pretension was already anticipating the correct continuation. The experience of surprise is phenomenological evidence that the future is already operatively present in every moment of listening. Husserl also distinguishes retention sharply from recollection. Recollection is a distinct act in which a past experience is brought explicitly back into view, represented as a past event from which I am temporally distant. Retention is not a representing act at all. It is the passive trailing of the just past within the current experience itself. The difference is between hearing the melody as it flows and deliberately remembering how the piece sounded last summer. Both involve the past, but they have fundamentally different intentional structures. Recollection posits the past as past in a deliberate act. Retention modifies the present from within without requiring any separate act of directedness. Now comes the problem that Husserl called the most difficult in all of phenomenology. Retention is itself an intentional act, directed at the just past phase of the object. But it is also itself a phase of the flowing stream of consciousness, which means it, too, is subject to retentional modification as consciousness moves forward. The retention of a retained note is a retention of a retention. This generates a two-dimensional structure, one axis running along the flow of the stream, retaining previous retentions as they recede, another axis running from the stream itself to the object it is conscious of. Husserl named these axes the longitudinal intentionality running along the stream, and the transverse intentionality directed at the object. The deeper difficulty is this: if the temporal stream constitutes time, what constitutes the stream? If you posit a second-order stream to constitute the first one, you need a third-order stream to constitute the second, and the regress never terminates. Husserl's answer is that the stream is self-constituting. Its self-appearance does not require a separate act of consciousness to observe it, because self-manifestation is built into the very structure of the flowing. As he put it in the lectures, the flow does not need to be seen in a second flow. It constitutes itself as a phenomenon in itself. The stream is, in his word, absolute. Not absolute in the sense of metaphysically secure, but absolute in the sense of not requiring anything outside itself for its self-manifestation. This answer has been contested from two different directions in contemporary literature. From one direction, Derrida argued in Voice and Phenomenon that the living present, which Husserl presents as a form of self-presence, is already internally divided by retention. If every now phase already carries a retention of the just past, then no moment is ever simply present to itself. Difference is constitutive of presence all the way down. On this reading, Husserl's Phenomenology secretly undermines its own foundationalist ambition. From the other direction, Zahavi and others have argued that this critique misreads Husserl. The retention structure does not divide the living present, but constitutes its unity as an extended, flowing whole. The debate remains genuinely open, and it matters because how you resolve it determines whether phenomenology can function as transcendental philosophy at all. What the time analysis clearly established was that every moment of experience already exceeds what is strictly given in the punctual present. Consciousness is always trailing a past it did not choose, and leaning into a future it cannot fully determine. This excess is not a deficiency of experience, but its constitutive structure. And once you see that every experience is saturated with absent content, the content just receded, the content about to arrive, you are ready for Husserl's most underappreciated insight, that every act of consciousness is also directed at a vast range of further possible experiences that are never actualized, but are always co-present as a field of anticipation. Part 5. The horizon structure. How consciousness exceeds every actual experience. Set a coffee cup on the table in front of you and look at it from where you are sitting. You see one face, the rim, the visible portion of the outer wall, the handle if it is turned toward you. The back of the cup is hidden. Yet you do not perceive half a cup or an open-ended surface with an uncertain continuation. You perceive a complete three-dimensional cup with a specific back surface, an interior, a bottom sitting on the table. Something must account for this surplus, the presence in your experience of content that is not currently being sensed. The obvious answer is inference. You infer the back of the cup from past experience with cups. But phenomenological analysis resists this explanation, and for a specific reason. Inference is a cognitive act that operates on available premises to reach a conclusion that is absent from direct experience. What Husserl describes is something that operates within perception itself, not after it. The back of the cup is not concluded. It is co-given, present in a distinctive mode of absence that is different in character from both sensation and inference. Husserl called this mode of givenness appresentation, and he embedded it within a broader concept of the horizon. Every perceived object comes with two kinds of horizon. The inner horizon consists of the further possible determinations of this very object. If I turn the cup, what I will see will be constrained and anticipated by what I already see. The outer horizon consists of the other objects in the perceptual field against which this cup stands, The table, the room, the objects behind me that I am not attending to, but that are co-present as a background. And behind both horizons lies what Husserl calls the world horizon, the universal background context presupposed by all possible experience, the world as a whole as an always already there framework. The world is not an object among objects. It is the horizon of all horizons. The philosophical weight of this analysis is considerable. Husserl is not simply saying that perception involves some background context in a vague sense. He is making a structural claim. Every act of consciousness is constitutively open beyond its actualized content, directed at a system of possible further experiences that are co-intended but not fulfilled. The noematic content of a perception is not just the presented face of the object, but the identical object X as the center of an open set of possible determinations, extending in all directions. You never perceive merely what is given. You always perceive more than what is given. And the more is not a fiction, but a genuine intentional content with its own phenomenological character. This character is what Husserl describes as emptily intended content, present in experience but not filled with intuitive givenness. The horizon structure also has a temporal dimension. The inner horizon is not only spatial, anticipating the back of the cup, but also temporal, anticipating how the object will appear as it changes or as I move around it. The retention-pretension structure analyzed in the time lectures is the micro-temporal version of what the horizon analysis describes at the macro level of whole perceptual acts. Both involve the same fundamental structure. Every actualized content is embedded in a penumbra of co-intended but non-actualized content that gives experience its sense of engaging a genuinely transcendent world rather than an enclosed present. Without horizons, you would perceive neither objects nor a world, but only a flow of surfaces with no depth or continuation. The horizon is the structure through which experience achieves its grip on something more than what it currently holds. Dan Zahavi extended this analysis in a direction Husserl acknowledged but did not fully develop. If the back of the cup is co-given, as what another observer positioned differently could currently see, then the inner horizon of every perceptual object is not purely a structure of my possible perceptions. It already makes implicit reference to the perceptions of possible others, to other possible positions in space from which this same object could be given. Horizontal intentionality thus implies intersubjectivity at its foundation. The transcendent, fully rounded object I perceive is given as, in principle, perceivable from multiple possible standpoints, including standpoints I do not occupy. This means the very act of perceiving an ordinary physical object already implicitly constitutes others as possible perceivers, before any explicit encounter with another person. Intersubjectivity is not something added on to a solitary constituting consciousness. It is embedded in the structure of individual perception. This finding put pressure on the transcendental framework from inside. If individual perception is already implicitly intersubjective, and if the transcendental reduction was supposed to reveal a sphere of pure individual consciousness prior to all worldly constitution, then the reduction cannot produce what Husserl claimed it would produce. The sphere of ownness, what Husserl called the primordial sphere in the Cartesian Meditations, is already organized by the anticipation of other standpoints before any concrete encounter with another person has occurred. But the deeper challenge to the transcendental framework came not from this internal tension, but from a prior question: whether consciousness in the form Husserl analyzed it is where meaning constitution starts at all. Before you can study the intentional structure of a perceptual act, you must already be deployed in a practical world, already oriented toward things as usable, dangerous, familiar, or alien. And that prior deployment is not itself a form of intentional consciousness. It is bodily. Part 6. The Body That Knows Before You Do. Merleau-Ponty against the Intellectualist and the Empiricist. In the First World War, a German soldier sustained a shrapnel wound to the back of his skull, damaging the occipital and parietal regions of his brain. His name was Johann Schneider, and he was studied in the 1920s by the neurologist Kurt Goldstein and the psychologist Adhemar Gelb. Schneider could perform his job as a wallet maker, threading needles, cutting leather, performing precise manual operations. If a mosquito bit him on the thigh, his hand went immediately to the spot. He could comb his hair and button his jacket, but he could not point to a part of his own body when asked to do so without being touched there first. He could not trace a circle in the air. He could not move his arm in an abstract trajectory requested by an examiner. He could perform any movement if it was embedded in a familiar practical situation solicited by the task itself, but he could not perform the same movement as an abstract commanded gesture without the concrete situational support. If shown a match and then the examiner blew it out, he could not reproduce the blowing action abstractly. But he could blow out a real candle placed in front of him without any difficulty. The asymmetry between concrete and abstract movement was consistent, severe, and irreducible. Now consider what the two dominant philosophical accounts of perception would say about this case. The empiricist account holds that perception is built bottom-up from sensory inputs, and that motor control flows from sensory guidance. On this account, Schneider's sensory channels and his motor channels should either both work or both fail, because abstract and concrete movements draw on the same sensory-motor apparatus. The asymmetry between practical and abstract movement has no place in empiricist theory. It is simply not a distinction the framework can generate. The intellectualist account, broadly Kantian, holds that the understanding actively imposes form on sensation, and that intentional movement is guided by conceptual representation. On this account, the abstract commanded movement should be the easier one, because it is the pure expression of conceptual intent. The concrete movement is the complicated one, requiring sensory guidance. Neither account predicts the asymmetry Schneider displays, and neither can explain it after the fact without adding auxiliary hypotheses that undermine the core theory. Merleau-Ponty takes this as a controlled experiment that reveals a layer of bodily agency both theories have systematically ignored. That layer is what he calls motor intentionality. Motor intentionality is the body's pre-reflective, pre-conceptual orientation toward the practical field, the body's capacity to be drawn toward and to execute movements by their situational relevance without requiring any mediating representation or conceptual command. It is not sensation because it is directed and organized around a practical task. It is not cognition, because it operates without concepts and below the threshold of thematic awareness. The point goes beyond Schneider's pathology to the normal case. When an experienced typist types a word, she does not consult a representation of the keyboard and compute which fingers to move. If you ask her where the letter R is, she may not be able to answer immediately without her hands. The knowledge is in the hands, in the habitual body schema, not stored anywhere as a propositional representation retrievable by introspection. Merleau-Ponty calls this motor habit, and he insists it is not merely automatic behaviour, but a genuine form of understanding, a bodily grasp of the situation that makes the act possible. The typist knows the keyboard in a way that is not reducible to any explicit representation she holds. This leads Merleau-Ponty to the concept of the body schema, which must be distinguished carefully from two superficially similar ideas. It is not a mental body image, a representation of your body parts stored somewhere in the brain that you consult when you move. And it is not simply a set of motor programs, automatized routines that execute in response to triggers. The body schema is the ongoing, dynamic, practical orientation of the lived body to the space of possible action organized around a current task. It is not a representation at all. It is a way of being already organized toward the world, a competence that is enacted rather than consulted. The blindly groping hand that finds the mosquito on the thigh does not calculate. It is already there in the sense that the thigh belongs to the body's practical field as a region of possible action. Both the empiricist and the intellectualist, Merleau-Ponty argues, share a hidden assumption. They both assume that the world is first constituted as an explicit object, and then the subject either reacts to it or acts on it. But motor intentionality shows that the world is given first as a field of solicitations and affordances, organized by the body's practical capacities before any explicit act of perception or cognition has occurred. You do not first perceive the cup and then decide to reach for it. Your hand is already in motion before the decision process, as your entire perceptual field is organized around the cup as a graspable thing. The primacy of perception, as Merleau-Ponty called it in his 1946 lecture, means that perception in its full, embodied, pre-reflective form is already a form of meaning-giving that precedes and grounds all conceptual activity. The body is a subject, not merely an instrument of a mental subject. This is where Merleau-Ponty's position creates genuine tension with Husserl's Transcendental project. For Husserl, meaning is constituted in and by consciousness, and the body appears within that constituting field as a peculiar object that is also a subject, the Lieb, as distinct from the Körper. But for Merleau-Ponty, the body does not appear within a constituting consciousness. The body is the constituting subject at the most fundamental level, and consciousness is built on top of this bodily engagement rather than underlying it. Meaning does not flow from a transcendental ego down into the body. It emerges from the body's practical engagement with the world and rises toward explicit awareness. If that is right, the transcendental reduction cannot achieve what Husserl claimed, because the layer it would have to bracket to reveal pure transcendental consciousness is not a layer it can reach behind. The question becomes whether this undermining of the transcendental standpoint requires abandoning Phenomenology's foundational ambitions entirely, or whether it simply shifts the question of foundation from consciousness to being in the world. Part 7. Being in the World as a Technical Claim. What Heidegger actually argued and why it undercuts Husserl. A carpenter driving a nail into a beam is not attending to the hammer. The hammer has vanished into the activity, transparent to the movement, felt only through the resistance of the wood and the accuracy of the strike. If asked to describe the hammer during the work, she would have to stop and look at it, at which point it becomes an object of inspection rather than a tool of use. It is the breaking or the misfire that makes the hammer visible, pulling it from its transparency into an explicit object of attention. Heidegger calls these two modes of encounter ready to hand and present at hand, and this distinction does not merely describe two psychological attitudes toward hammers. It is the diagnostic instrument through which he dismantles the assumption that underpins all of post-Cartesian philosophy, including Husserl's. Descartes modelled the mind as a res cogitans that apprehends a res extensa across an ontological gap. Husserl refined this picture. Consciousness is intentionally directed at objects, and phenomenology studies the structures of that directedness. But both frameworks begin with a subject confronting objects, and both treat that confrontation as the primary mode of human engagement with the world. Heidegger's argument is that this starting point describes a derived and deficient mode of engagement, not the primary one. The carpenter hammering does not first perceive the hammer as an object and then use it. The hammer is given originally as an item of equipment, as something whose being consists in its useful reference to other equipment, to nails, to the beam, to the wall being built, to whoever will inhabit the building. Heidegger calls this network of referential involvements an equipmental totality, and the world in his technical sense is precisely this totality, not a container of objects, but the structured background of significance within which any particular entity first shows up as what it is. The world is not perceived. It is the always already operative context that makes perception possible. This is not a psychological claim about habits or familiarity. It is an ontological claim. The being of things in their primary mode is not presence at hand, the mode that natural science and Husserlian reflection both assume as basic. The present at hand, the world as a collection of properties instantiated in objects, emerges only when the ready-to-hand breaks down, when the hammer's head flies off and you are forced to regard it as a thing with properties. Science begins in breakdown, and philosophy that takes the scientific mode as its starting point therefore begins one level too late. The point against Husserl is specific and surgical. Husserl's analysis begins with intentional acts directed at objects given in experience, and his reduction brackets the world to reveal the constituting consciousness that underlies it. But the carpenter's practical engagement with the hammer is not an intentional act directed at an object. It is a mode of being already within the world, already underway in a network of significance that no bracketing can precede, because bracketing is itself an act performed within that network. Heidegger replaces intentionality with what he calls circumspection, Umsicht, the practical sight of engagement, which is not a cognitive act directed at an object, but a way of moving within a significant field. The carpenter does not look at the hammer while hammering. Her circumspection traverses the whole workshop as an organized field of tasks and tools. Heidegger's name for the fundamental structure he is describing is being in the world, always hyphenated to signal that it is a unitary phenomenon. The in is not spatial containment. Dasein is not in the world the way water is in a glass. The in names a mode of dwelling, of being at home in and engaged with, which is prior to any subject-object split. Dasein does not first exist and then relate to a world. Being in the world is Dasein's fundamental way of being, and there is no Dasein prior to world from which to begin a Husserlian transcendental analysis. Every act of consciousness that Husserl analyzes, every perceiving, imagining and judging is already an ontic episode within an ontological structure that those acts presuppose. Husserl was doing phenomenology within the natural attitude while believing he had transcended it. The critique of Husserl that Dermot Moran and others have carefully reconstructed in recent scholarship is more surgical than the wholesale rejection it is sometimes read as. Heidegger did not reject intentionality. He argued that Husserl had characterized it in insufficiently ontological terms. He wanted to ask about the being of the intentional relation itself, not merely describe its structure. And his answer was that the basic form of being directed at something is not cognitive but existential. It is Care-Sorge, the fundamental structure whereby Dasein is always already projected toward its possibilities within a world with which it is always already involved. Care is not an attitude. It is the ontological condition of the possibility of any attitude at all. This is what the Hammer analysis reveals, not a lesson about tools, but a disclosure of the existential structure within which tools, people, tasks and thoughts all first show up as what they are. The unresolved tension in Heidegger's position concerns the status of what he is doing. He claims to be conducting a fundamental ontology, an inquiry into the meaning of being, using the analysis of Dasein as the entry point, because Dasein is the entity for which being is an issue. But this inquiry is itself performed by a Dasein situated historically, linguistically, culturally and factically. If every understanding of being is historically shaped, the question arises whether Heidegger's own fundamental ontology has the universal scope it claims, or whether it is itself a historically conditioned understanding masquerading as ontological bedrock. Heidegger eventually acknowledged this in his later work, turning from fundamental ontology to a meditation on the history of being, the sequence of distinct epochs in which being has shown up differently for human beings. Whether that turn is a deepening of the early position or a retreat from its claims remains one of the genuinely open disputes in Heidegger scholarship today. Part 8. The Other Who Cannot Be Constituted. Intersubjectivity, Empathy, and the Limits of Transcendental Method. Perform the transcendental reduction as rigorously as you can. Bracket all existence positing, all theoretical commitments, all background assumptions. What remains is the sphere of transcendental consciousness, with its structures of intentionality, time and horizon, and its constituting activity through which the world is given with the sense and validity it has. Now look around the room. There are other people in it. How do they appear within the sphere of transcendental consciousness? If the other person is just another physical object, they offer no challenge. They are constituted the way all physical objects are, through horizontal intentionality and profile givenness. But the other person is not an object. She is another subject, another consciousness, another centre of intentional life directing itself at a world in its own right. She is not given to you as another object of your experience, because another object of your experience is by definition constituted by your experience. If you constitute the other person, she becomes your intentional correlate rather than a genuinely independent subject. But if she is not constituted by you, she is something that appears within your experience while exceeding the constituting activity that generates all other appearances. This is not a problem Husserl sidestepped. He recognized it as the deepest challenge to transcendental phenomenology. The fifth Cartesian meditation contains his most sustained attempt at a response. Husserl introduces a second reduction, the reduction to the sphere of ownness or primordiality, which brackets everything that refers to another subject, including the cultural objects around you, the chairs and tables that were made by others, the language you think in. What remains is a minimal primordial sphere, your living body as the 0 point of orientation, the surrounding field of physical nature, and your own stream of consciousness. Within this primordial sphere, you encounter another human body similar to yours, moving and behaving in ways that resemble how your own body moves from the inside. This similarity triggers what Husserl calls a passive synthesis of pairing, an associative coupling between your own lived body as experienced from inside and the other body as encountered from outside. Through this pairing, the other body is appresented as also inhabited by a stream of experience, as a lived body rather than merely a physical body. The appresentation involved in the constitution of the other is different in kind from the appresentation involved in perceiving the hidden back of a cup. The back of the cup could, in principle, be made present by simply moving to a different position. The other's experience cannot be made present in the same sense, because to directly experience another's experience would be to collapse the distinction between self and other entirely. The other's interiority is necessarily inaccessible to direct givenness, and yet it is genuinely given as inaccessible, not merely inferred. This is what Husserl means by appresentation in the specifically intersubjective sense, a genuine form of intentional givenness that has the structure of reference to what is in principle not directly givable. It is this peculiar structure that makes the other genuinely other, rather than a mere projection of the self. The argument is more sophisticated than its critics usually acknowledge, but it faces three objections that are difficult to deflect. The first is the circularity objection, pressed most sharply by scholars like David Bell. The reduction to the sphere of ownness is supposed to isolate a domain prior to all reference to other subjects. But the very concept of a body similar to mine already presupposes a kind of comparison that requires some prior acquaintance with otherness as a category. You cannot recognize similarity without already having a concept of the same and the other. The primordial sphere from which the constitution of the other supposedly begins is not as free from intersubjective reference as Husserl claims. The second objection concerns the body similarity requirement. Husserl's pairing mechanism depends on the other body being sufficiently similar to my own for the associative coupling to trigger. This generates consequences about which kinds of beings we can recognize as others, and those consequences are phenomenologically and ethically uncomfortable. The third objection is the most fundamental, and it comes from within the phenomenological tradition itself. Husserl's analysis reduces the constitution of the other to an operation I perform starting from my primordial sphere. The other is the terminus of a constituting act that originates in me. But if the other is genuinely other, she cannot be the product of my constituting activity. She must be prior to it, confronting me from outside rather than emerging from inside. Levinas presses this objection without remainder. Heidegger's response was to bypass the constitution problem entirely. Dasein's being in the world is always already a being with, Mitsein, and others are co-given in the structure of the world before any explicit encounter. But this dissolves the problem rather than solving it, because it says the other is always already there without explaining how the other's genuine alterity, her resistance to being absorbed into my world, is preserved. The tensions between these positions are still the primary engine of debate in contemporary phenomenology of social cognition. Part 9, Sartre's Reversal, Consciousness as Nothingness, and the Problem it Creates for Agency. Husserl's transcendental ego is a constituting consciousness that underlies all experience as its formal unity. It is the I that runs through all my acts, the pole of identity toward which all self-reference converges. In 1936, Sartre published a brief but devastating paper called The Transcendence of the Ego, arguing that Husserl had made a fundamental error. If consciousness is defined by intentionality, by its essential directedness toward what it is not, then there is no room within consciousness for any ego as a resident inhabitant. The ego, Sartre argued, is not inside consciousness, but outside it, an object that consciousness constitutes through a secondary act of reflection, just as the ego constitutes any other object. Pure pre-reflective consciousness is impersonal, anonymous, with no inner subject at its center. This move has a specific strategic purpose. If the ego is transcendent to consciousness rather than immanent within it, then the threat of solipsism is diffused. There is no privileged ego that consciousness belongs to and must laboriously extend toward others. Consciousness, in its primary pre-reflective mode, is already out in the world, already emptied of inner content, already at the things themselves. This is closer to Heidegger's displacement of consciousness by being in the world than it might appear. But Sartre retains consciousness as his central concept, while radicalizing what it means. In Being and Nothingness from 1943, he argues that consciousness is not a thing, not a substance, not even a property of the brain. Consciousness is nothing, where nothing is a precise ontological category. The being that lacks nothing, that is fully what it is, self-identical, incapable of negation, Sartre calls being in itself, the mode of being of things. A stone is what it is. Its being is a dense, self-sufficient plenitude with no gaps, no possibility, no negation. Consciousness is the being that is not what it is, and is what it is not. It is always a step ahead of itself, never coinciding with any fixed identity, projecting itself toward what it is not yet, retaining what it no longer is, negating the given toward possibilities. This is not a deficiency of consciousness, but its distinctive ontological structure. Consciousness brings nothingness into the world precisely because it is the being for whom the difference between the actual and the possible, the real and the absent, the present and the negated, is a constitutive feature of its very existence. Sartre builds his case through concrete examples. He is sitting in a café waiting for his friend Pierre, who has not arrived. There is no shortage of beings in the café, tables, chairs, patrons, waiters, cups, but what he perceives is the absence of Pierre, a specific nothingness that stands out against the field of present beings. The absence of Pierre is not merely a failure to see him. It is a genuine phenomenological feature of the situation, one that the world in itself, the collection of tables and patrons, could never generate. Absences, negations, lacks and possibilities exist only for a being that projects beyond the given, and that being is consciousness. The ability to negate is thus not a linguistic trick, but an ontological structure, and it is precisely what makes freedom possible. Freedom follows directly from the nothingness of consciousness. If consciousness were a thing with a fixed nature, that nature would determine its responses to its situation. But consciousness is nothing, not a fixed nature, not a determined essence, not a property bundle. It is always in question for itself, always determining itself through its choices of which possibilities to project toward. This is not a freedom one can decline. To choose not to choose is itself a choice, a projection of oneself as someone who does not choose. And this is the structure Sartre calls bad faith, the attempt to treat oneself as a thing with a fixed nature rather than a freedom, to deny the nothingness of consciousness by pretending that one's character, role, social position or past determines one's actions with the necessity of a causal law. The famous example is the waiter who plays at being a waiter with excessive precision, whose every gesture is a little too mechanical, whose manner is a little too perfectly adjusted to the social script. He is performing his role with an intensity that signals he has identified with it, is trying to coincide with the being of a waiter. But a waiter is not a thing, and he knows it. He chose to be here this morning. He will not be here forever. He can walk out. The performance is bad faith because it masks the nothingness at the heart of his situation behind the appearance of a determined nature. Bad faith is not weakness or dishonesty in the ordinary sense. It is an ontological strategy for escaping the vertigo of a freedom that has no ground and no guarantee. Sartre's claim, notoriously, is that it is an escape that cannot ultimately succeed, because the structure of consciousness as nothingness reasserts itself even within the flight from it. The problem this creates for agency is sharp and remains genuinely contested. If consciousness is pure nothingness with no fixed nature, and if freedom is absolute in the sense that no factical conditions determine it, then the concepts of character, motivation, and practical identity become deeply unstable. Sartre's framework allows virtually any action to be redescribed as a free choice, which seems to explain everything and therefore explain nothing. His response is that radical freedom coexists with facticity, the givenness of one's situation, one's body, one's past, one's historical moment, which consciousness must take up and project through, but in a variety of possible ways. The facticity of being a working-class person in occupied France is real. The freedom is in how that situation is taken up and responded to. But the precise relationship between facticity and freedom, how much weight the situation constrains, and how much remains genuinely undetermined, was a tension Sartre never satisfactorily resolved, and that his later work in the Critique of Dialectical Reason tried to address by embedding individual freedom in the heavier structures of collective historical practice. Part 10. Levinas's Rupture. Phenomenology pushed past the limits of the same. Every phenomenological analysis examined so far begins from the same point. A consciousness or a Dasein or a for itself engages with its world, constitutes its objects, discloses its possibilities, or projects its freedom. Even when others are encountered, they are encountered within a world that is ultimately organized around my projections, my possibilities, my disclosures. The other arrives as a problem for a philosophy that has already decided to begin from the same, from the self's own constituting activity, and must then explain how genuine alterity is possible from within that starting point. Levinas argues that this starting point is not merely incomplete, but ethically disastrous, and that the tradition's failure to escape it has consequences that reach from philosophy all the way to the politics of extermination. The critique is that precise. Levinas's diagnosis, published in Totality and Infinity in 1961, is that Western philosophy from Parmenides onward has been governed by an ontology of totality, the attempt to comprehend everything within a unified system of being in which every apparent difference is ultimately a moment within the same. For Husserl, the world is what is constituted within transcendental subjectivity. For Heidegger, what is encountered within the clearing of Dasein's ontological disclosure. In both cases, the other person is ultimately brought within a framework that originates in the same. Even the constitution of the other as genuinely other is still my constitution, still an operation I perform, still a comprehension of alterity from within my own horizon. Levinas calls this tendency the reduction of the other to the same, and he argues that it is the philosophical correlate of a violence that also shows up in politics, war, and every system that subordinates persons to categories, roles, or historical necessities. Totality does philosophical violence before any physical violence occurs. Against totality, Levinas proposes infinity, a concept he takes from Descartes' third meditation. Descartes notes that his idea of God contains more objective reality than can be accounted for by his own finite mind, and concludes that God must be the cause of this idea. Levinas evacuates the theological content but retains the structural insight. There is a mode of givenness in which what is given exceeds the capacity of the consciousness receiving it, overflows the intentional act that aims at it, and cannot be contained within any horizon. This is not a failure of cognition. It is a positive phenomenological structure, a mode of being encountered by what is more than what I can constitute or comprehend. And this is the mode in which the other person's face is given. The face is Levinas's term for the other's presentation as absolutely other, prior to any categorization, any thematization, any constitution. The face is not a perceived object. It is not the skin of the cheeks and the outline of the eyes, though these are what you see when you look at another person. The face, as Levinas uses the term, is the event of the other's irreducibility, presenting itself, the moment in which the other's vulnerability and the prohibition against harming her are given together immediately before any theoretical operation. The command, "Thou shalt not kill," is not a deduction from a principle. It is what the face itself utters. Ethics, for Levinas, is not derived from ontology, but precedes it. The responsibility I find myself under when confronted with the other's face is not something I chose or constituted. It is prior to any choice, prior to any act of consciousness, an election that falls on me before I have a self, to be elected. This is the precise point at which Levinas leaves phenomenology behind while claiming to radicalize it. Husserl's phenomenology moves from the phenomenon to the constituting consciousness that makes it possible. Levinas is arguing for a phenomenon, the face, that makes demands on consciousness rather than being constituted by it. The direction of grounding is reversed. I am not the source from which the meaning of the other flows. The other's call constitutes me as responsible before I constitute anything at all. Levinas, in Otherwise Than Being, from 1974, pushes this further, describing subjectivity itself as being a hostage to the other. The self is not a self that subsequently encounters others, but an ethical exposure that is the condition of selfhood as such. The objection that strikes most readers immediately is that Levinas's account is difficult to square with anything like a phenomenological description. Phenomenology describes what appears in experience. The face, as Levinas means, it is explicitly described as exceeding any appearance, any thematization, any intentional grasp. How can you do phenomenology of what is by definition beyond phenomenological givenness? Levinas's response, worked out over both major books, is that the trace of what exceeds appearance is itself phenomenologically available in the structure of ethical demand, in the specific character of the responsibility that falls on one in the face-to-face encounter. The overflow is not invisible. It is precisely what gives the ethical relation its non-negotiable character, its difference from all merely instrumental or merely cognitive encounters. Whether this is a genuine extension of phenomenological method or its destruction from within is the question that drives the ongoing debate between defenders of transcendental phenomenology and those who take the ethical turn. Part 11. The Naturalization Problem. Can phenomenology survive contact with cognitive science? In 1996, Francisco Varela published a paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies titled Neurophenomenology, a methodological remedy for the hard problem. Varela had read Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and the Madhyamika Buddhist tradition with equal seriousness, and had spent decades working in theoretical neuroscience and immunology. His proposal was that first-person phenomenological accounts of experience could be systematically brought into a mutually constraining relationship with third-person neuroscientific accounts of brain activity. Neither side would simply reduce the other. Each would use the other's findings to guide its own inquiry. The program was called Neurophenomenology, and it attracted serious researchers in both traditions. The question it raises is whether this collaboration is a genuine synthesis or a category error. The hard problem of consciousness, as David Chalmers formulated it in 1995, concerns why any physical process gives rise to subjective experience at all. Even a complete functional and neurological description of pain would not, on the face of it, explain why pain feels the way it does from the inside. Varela thought phenomenology could help precisely here, because phenomenology had developed rigorous methods for describing the structure of experience from the first-person perspective, and these descriptions could generate specific constraints on what a neuroscientific account of consciousness must account for. His lab conducted experiments in which subjects were trained in phenomenological observation, asked to report on the character of their experience during perceptual tasks, and those reports were then correlated with electroencephalographic recordings of large-scale neural synchrony. The results showed that specific phenomenological distinctions, differences in the quality of attentional readiness subjects reported before a visual stimulus, correlated with different patterns of neural synchronization. Phenomenological categories were generating empirically testable predictions. Dan Zahavi has argued with considerable force that this program purchases empirical tractability at the cost of phenomenology's fundamental methodological commitment. Transcendental phenomenology is not just a vocabulary for describing experience. It is a disciplinary method that aims at the essential structures of consciousness, as such, structures that are not contingent psychological facts about human brains, but necessary features of any possible experience. When phenomenological categories are deployed as independent variables in neuroscientific experiments, they are being used as descriptions of particular subjects' psychological states in particular empirical situations. This is phenomenological psychology, as Husserl himself distinguished it, not transcendental phenomenology. The eidetic status of the structures being described, their claim to necessity rather than mere generality, is abandoned as soon as they enter the empirical lab. Zahavi's position is not anti-science. He advocates what he calls mutual enlightenment, a dialogue between phenomenology and cognitive science, in which each can inform the other's questions without either being reduced to the other's terms. Gallagher's response is that this distinction between transcendental and phenomenological psychology does useful work in pure philosophy, but becomes a blockade in practice. Phenomenological insights about body schema, motor intentionality, pre-reflective self-awareness, and temporal consciousness have been enormously productive when used to design experiments, frame hypotheses, and interpret data in cognitive science and clinical psychology. The question is not whether these insights are being used in a transcendentally pure manner, but whether they are advancing genuine understanding of mind and experience. His notion of front-loaded phenomenology proposes incorporating phenomenological analysis into experimental design itself, using it to generate more refined questions rather than just more refined descriptions. On this view, the philosophical status of phenomenological claims is a separate question from their scientific utility, and insisting on the former as a condition of the latter blocks a productive collaboration for reasons that are primarily territorial. The debate between Zahavi and Gallagher on this point has been ongoing since the early 2000s and does not have a clear resolution. There is a deeper structural difficulty that neither neurophenomenology nor mutual enlightenment fully addresses. Phenomenology's core commitment, from Husserl's anti-psychologism forward, is that the structures it describes are not contingent facts about human cognitive architecture, but features of experience as such. If phenomenological claims are supported by empirical neuroscience, they become, in the same move, fallible and contingent. They could, in principle, be revised by further empirical evidence. But if they are fallible and contingent, they are no longer eidetic structures with the kind of necessity Husserl claimed. If they are not subject to empirical revision, then the empirical collaboration with neuroscience is not genuinely mutual, because phenomenology's fundamental claims are insulated from the kind of pressure that makes science scientific. Either phenomenology becomes empirical and loses its foundational status, or it retains its foundational status, and the collaboration with science is less than it appears to be. This is not a problem that more carefully designed experiments can dissolve, because it is a methodological and philosophical problem about the structure of phenomenological claims themselves. It bears directly on whether phenomenology can contribute to the hard problem, because the hard problem requires exactly the kind of first-person evidential basis that phenomenology can provide. But providing it within a scientific framework requires subjecting those reports to third-person standards of evidence that may not be appropriate for them. Enactivism, represented in different forms by Thompson, Varela and Evan Thompson's Mind in Life from 2007, has tried to dissolve the hard problem rather than solve it, by arguing that consciousness is not a product of brain states, but a property of the whole organism-environment system, as enacted through sensory-motor coupling. Whether enactivism succeeds in dissolving the hard problem or merely relocates it to the organization of the whole system is, again, genuinely open. Part 12. Where the method stands now: Transcendental, Hermeneutic, Embodied, and Critical Phenomenology in active dispute. Phenomenology has not arrived at a consensus. What exists instead is a set of live and structurally deep disagreements about what the method requires, what kind of claims it can generate, and who its legitimate subject is. These are not merely pedagogical disputes between rival traditions. They concern the foundations of the entire project, and their resolution would determine whether phenomenology continues as a unified discipline or becomes a family of related but incompatible enterprises. The disagreements are worth mapping precisely because they do not reduce to political differences or stylistic preferences. Each position is driven by a specific philosophical argument, and in several cases that argument has received its most precise formulation only in work from the past decade. Transcendental phenomenology, in the line running from Husserl through Zahavi and Sarah Heinemar, holds that phenomenology's primary task remains the eidetic description of essential structures of consciousness, those that necessarily characterize any possible experience, rather than merely any human experience as a psychological matter. On this view, the reductions, whatever difficulties they generate, are not optional. They are what separates phenomenology from description and from empirical psychology. The most sophisticated contemporary version of this position does not pretend the reductions are fully achievable. It argues that the attempt to perform them is philosophically productive even when it fails, because the points of failure reveal the structures that resist full constitutive grounding. This is a post-Finkian development of transcendental phenomenology that takes seriously the internal critique from Part 3 and builds it into the method rather than treating it as a refutation. Hermeneutic phenomenology, running from Heidegger through Gadamer and Ricoeur, abandoned the transcendental aspiration and replaced it with the claim that all understanding is historically situated interpretation, that there is no view from nowhere, and that the circular movement between parts and wholes of meaning, the hermeneutic circle, is the inescapable structure of any inquiry into experience. The dispute between transcendental and hermeneutic phenomenologists on the question of whether eidetic variation can reveal necessary structures, or whether what appears necessary is always the sediment of a particular historical tradition, remains philosophically live. Jonah Oxela's 2022 European Journal of Philosophy paper on de Beauvoir as phenomenologist is a recent example of this debate playing out. Her argument is that a genuine historico-transcendental inquiry requires both the phenomenological reduction and the acknowledgement that the subject performing it is historically situated in ways that inflect even the structures revealed. Whether that combination is coherent or internally inconsistent is not yet settled. Critical Phenomenology, which has generated its own journal, Puncta, and a growing body of work by thinkers including Lisa Gwenther, Gail Salomon and George Yancey, argues that the classical frameworks systematically presuppose the standpoint of a particular historical subject, typically white, European, male, and able-bodied, and present the structures arising from that standpoint as universal features of consciousness as such. The eidetic reduction that is supposed to bracket all contingency cannot bracket the historicity of the subject performing it, because that historicity shapes not only the content of experience, but its very structural organization. This is not the same objection as the hermeneutic one, though it is related. The hermeneutic objection says all understanding is interpretation, and therefore no eidetic reduction is possible. The critical objection says specific forms of structural oppression, racial violence, gendered subordination, disability and incarceration produce distinctive phenomenological structures that a universal transcendental analysis not only misses but actively misrepresents as deviant or absent. Frantz Fanon's analysis of black experience under colonial racism in Black Skin, White Masks is the canonical resource here. His description of the epidermal racial schema that overlays and disrupts the body schema Merleau-Ponty described is a phenomenological finding that the classical framework had no resources to anticipate. The transcendental response to critical phenomenology contains a real insight that is often obscured by the heat of the debate. It concedes that any particular phenomenologist's access to essential structures may be skewed by their historical position, while maintaining that the structures themselves are not historically contingent. The phenomenology of a black person living under racial terror and the phenomenology of an insulated academic are both access points to the same structures of temporality, spatiality, and embodiment, differently illuminated, differently deformed, differently revealed. On this view, critical phenomenology does not replace but enriches eidetic analysis by providing experiential access to structural features that normalized experience fails to notice. The dispute then concerns how much of what is presented as universal structure is genuinely necessary, and how much is the content of a particular form of life that has successfully concealed its contingency. This is the version of the debate that has been most productive in recent literature, because it is not a mere clash of political commitments, but a philosophical argument about the depth at which contingency penetrates structure. Embodied and inactivist phenomenology continues to develop through the work of Gallagher, Evan Thompson, Alva Noe and others, pushing the implications of Merleau-Ponty's insight into body schema, motor intentionality and affordance well beyond what phenomenology of perception itself established. The concept of intercorporeality, the mutual shaping of body schemas through shared practice, gesture and social interaction, has generated a productive research program in both philosophy and developmental psychology. The question this program faces, identified sharply by Zahavi, is whether it retains any genuine phenomenological specificity or has become a form of naturalism with phenomenological vocabulary. If the body schema is ultimately a neural construction, And if motor intentionality is implemented in specific sensor-emotor circuits, the phenomenological description adds precision to neuroscience, but loses its claim to reveal something about experience that neuroscience cannot in principle capture. Whether pre-reflective bodily experience is genuinely irreducible to the third-person descriptions of neuroscience and evolutionary biology is not a question any of these programs has answered convincingly. It may be the question that defines phenomenology's relation to science for the next generation. The thread that runs through every dispute reviewed in these 12 parts is a single unresolved tension. Phenomenology was founded on the conviction that the structures of experience can be described with the same rigor that mathematics describes its objects, that there is something here to be investigated that neither empirical science nor speculative metaphysics had properly identified. The tradition's most productive thinkers, from Husserl through Levinas, found again and again that these structures resist the reduction to foundations that the founding conviction requires. The stream of consciousness constitutes itself without a further ground. The horizon exceeds every actualized experience without ever being given in itself. The other person appears within my world while refusing the constitution that would make that appearance coherent. The body understands before consciousness knows. Being in the world precedes the subject-object split that the analysis of it must invoke. Whether these resistances show that phenomenology has genuinely disclosed the limits of what experience can ground, or whether they show that the transcendental aspiration itself was mistaken from the start, is the question the tradition has been working on for a century. It has not yet answered it, and the answer, if it comes, will require precisely the kind of patient, technically precise and philosophically uncompromising attention that phenomenology at its best has always demanded.